Okay, so my project was on the draft riots during the Civil War and those involved. In the North, the Union Army was at first solely manned by volunteers, and each of the Union states having a set quota based on their population. However, in 1863, the level of volunteers had begun to diminish. Due to this, Congress decided to do something it had never done before in United States history: pass a federal conscription law, also known as a draft. On the left side of the screen can be seen a poster that was hung up around New Hampshire that was asking for strong men to volunteer for the Union's war effort. The newly passed conscription law was ultimately one-sided, that being it was biased against the poor in favor of the wealthy. The rich were able to hire substitutes to fill in their spot for the draft and were even able to buy immunity from the draft at the price of $300. Understandably, those who were drafted were furious and criticized the government for basically protecting those who had money and started the war over those who had a meager worth to their name and didn't start the war. The drawing on the left is an example of the wealthy getting in line to avoid a draft, as it was fairly common to those who were able to do so to do it. The draft was unpopular, especially to those in democratic strongholds of the North, namely New York City. The population of New York City had a large percentage of it become Irish after many Irish fled to the United States after the potato famine in Ireland. Most of these Irishmen were dirt poor and lived in unhealthy environments, many of who were jobless due to the Irish being discriminated against by whites who would rather hire blacks. So in 1863, underprivileged anti-black Irish Americans began to riot when the war started and were shoved into the war instead of those with wealth who had the ability to pay for their freedom. These riots lasted for several days. Many of lives were lost, many of them black, who were hanged by the racist Irish Americans. Places outside of New York City in the North were met with smaller and less occasional riots, although still rigid with resentment. The drawing on the right is an example of an angry Irish mob lynching and burning a black man in protest. In the beginning, more than 90% of Union troops were volunteers that joined under patriotic and social pressures. However, as numbers began to dwindle, bounties were offered by federal, state, and local authorities in order to entice people into enlisting for the war. Some of these people were able to walk away with up to $1,000. With this new attraction came a new group of people called bounty brokers, many of whom were Irish or German Americans. A numerous amount of these men deserted and volunteered at another location in order to get another hefty sum of cash. Over the course of the Civil War, the Union recorded over 200,000 deserters of all classes. The paper on the right is an illustration of how many people attempted this method of making money and how much can be made from it. The paper on the right also acknowledges that deserting and rejoining is a noteworthy way to make money. The South had similar issues to that of the North, and that its numbers for volunteers began to dwindle early on, especially due to the fact that the Confederacy was much less populous. The Confederacy had to pass a conscription law for people between the ages of 17 and 50 as early as April 1862, which was also nearly a year earlier than when the Union had to pass their own conscription law. The cartoon on the right is a satirical take on the Confederacy and their low levels of enlistment. The cartoon depicts a Northern Unionist being forced to fight alongside the Confederacy and a man unwilling to do so, which highlights to what extent the Confederacy would go to get men into their army. The South also had other similar issues to that of the North, in that the wealthy were able to hire a substitute for their place in the draft or by exemption. In the South, however, slave owners or overseers with 20 or more slaves were also excused from being drafted into the army. Understandably, those who were less prosperous were bitter, with many complaining that the Civil War was a rich man's war but a poor man's fight. The South had no large-scale riots ever take place, unlike the North. However, those who were drafted attentively avoided areas that were inhabited by mountain whites, who were tainted with names such as traitors and Yankee lovers. The drawing on the left depicts Union and Confederate soldiers sharing rations instead of fighting, due to many soldiers believing it wasn't their war to fight, and since rations were scarce at points, both sides shared. That is the end of my project. I hope you enjoyed.